1. Introduction. Who has ever occupied himself seriously with the investigation of the night side of nature, or studied the works of Theophrastus Paracelsus, and not become acquainted with the celebrated Untersberg, the mountain of the lower world, and its mysterious inhabitants, the fairies and gnomes? Like a gigantic outpost of the Austrian Alps, this snow-capped wing of the mountains stands on the frontier of Germany, overlooking the Bavarian plains, dotted with hills, forests, and lakes. Its summit, dwelling above the clouds, dominates the valley through which the Salzach River winds its way to the Inn and the Danube. Danube, seen from the north side, where the city of Salzburg is nestled among the hills, the mountain looks tame enough, rising in undulating forest-covered lines up to a height of some 7,000 feet. But on the south side it exhibits an almost endless variety of perpendicular walls, formed of marble rocks thousands of feet high and interrupted by deep ravines and chasms, craggy cliffs, spurs, and precipices, over which in the time of spring, when the snow begins to melt, great avalanches come thundering down, and sharp I may detect in many an inaccessible spot mysterious caves that seem to penetrate into the bowels of that mysterious mountain. If you will take the trouble of climbing up to these dizzy heights, you will find yourself in a new world, for there the Untersberg appears not as one single mountain, but as a mountain chain, of which each separate link has its special aspect and character, being separated from its neighbor by deep chasms, through which the mountain streams rush. There is no end of waterfalls, caves, and labyrinths of boulders, where the inexperienced wanderer may lose his way, especially if he is misled by the gnomes, which may easily occur if his intentions are not pure. The Untersberg is known to be inhabited by certain kinds of elemental spirits of nature, some of which are good and benevolent, others of a wicked and malicious nature and inimical to mankind. And there are innumerable tales circulating among the people in the neighborhood, telling about the doings of the gnomes, fairies, wild women, and giants, dwelling within caves and in gorgeous marble halls and grottos filled with gold and precious stones that will turn into dead leaves and stones when seen in the light of day. Some of the friendly tribes come out of the Untersberg on certain occasions, and they are said to have sometimes associated with the inhabitants of our plane of existence, partaking in the dances and amusements of the peasants, and even taking stray children with them into the Untersberg. And, incredible as it may appear, it is even asserted by those who know that marriages have taken place between citizens of our world and the inhabitants of the kingdom of gnomes, and that these spirits of nature, being themselves not immortal, seek to obtain immortality by their union with a mortal man. The majority of the gnomes, therefore, also love plain, truthful, and unsophisticated human beings, such as possess a soul in which the light of the immortal spirit may be perceived, and with these they are ready to associate. But with soulless beings, such as sophisticated, skeptical, arrogant, short-sighted, and opinionated scientists, whose hearts are dead, and whose brains are swollen with the products of their own fancy, they will have nothing to do. To such they never show themselves, but love to play tricks upon them whenever they come with a view of invading their kingdom. Of course, it is known to everybody that within the mysterious depths of the Untersberg there dwells the soul of a great emperor in his astral form. There, together with his retinue, he sleeps an enchanted sleep, waiting for the liberation of his country. Sometimes very suddenly, even on a clear summer day, clouds are seen to issue from the sides of the mountain. Grotesquely formed ghost-like mists arise from caverns and precipices, crawling and gliding slowly upwards toward the top, and from the neighboring peaks also clouds of monstrous shapes and sometimes of gigantic proportions come floating on, until the head of the Untersberg is surrounded by a surging sea of vapors growing dense and dark. Then a clap of thunder reverberates through the rocks, awakening hundreds of echoes, and forked streaks of lightning flash down into the valley. The Storm King arises, howling dismally through the forest, breaking down old trees and hurling them into the precipices below. On such occasions, the people in the valleys piously make the sign of the cross and whisper to each other. The great emperor has awakened and is reviewing his troops. He is angry because he sees that the black ravens are still flying around the top of the Untersberg. This, of course, I hold to be a fable, and the emperor in the Untersberg is well known to the wise. But as to the dark birds referred to, they are typified by certain black-robed and stiff-necked gentlemen, whom you may frequently meet. The liberation for which the emperor waits also seems to me not that from any foreign yoke, but the redemption from selfishness with its consequent evils. Poor emperor! You may have to wait still another 1,000 years in the world of the gnomes before you will be able to resume control over your kingdom. Sleep in peace. The time will not seem to you long, for it is not you who suffers, and there is no measurement of time during sleep or in eternity. Owing to the increase of modern culture and its accompanying sophistry and skepticism, visible intercourse with the gnomes has become of comparatively rare occurrence, especially because their kindness has often been abused and their services misapplied, as the following story will show, which I may be permitted to insert, as it is not without bearing upon the events told in the succeeding chapters. A short distance from the city of Salzburg, and upon a hill covered by a forest of pines, there stood in ancient times the castle of Tallenstein, of which now only some remnants are left. The walls are in ruins, but these go to show that formerly they were parts of a palatial building. One remnant composed of huge square stones still indicates the extent of the large banqueting hall where festivals took place, and it is said that on certain nights the orgies which these stones witnessed are spectrally repeated and enacted in the astral light by the ghost-like shapes of deceased ladies and knights. While not far off there is a dilapidated tower of massive structure enclosing a deep hole in the ground where the subterranean dungeon was located, the oubliette, or living tomb, in which poor wretches for some offense were buried alive and forgotten, left to starve or suffocate. It is said that, during the nights when the ghosts in the banqueting hall hold gruesome carousals, cries and groans and wails may be heard coming from the bottom of that well. These things I do not find difficult to believe, for we often find similar instances of the proximity of luxury and misery among the living in this our material world. In ancient times, the owner of the castle was Burkhard von Tallenstein, a youthful and valorous knight, admired by all the ladies in the country on account of the voluminous mass of golden hair which adorned his head. This, together with his manliness and beauty, gained for him the hearts of all those fair ladies, except one, and this was the very one for whose possession he craved, namely, the very beautiful but proud Julia von Horst. He had seen her only once, but that was enough to make him fall desperately in love with her face and figure. He had been happy enough until he was so unfortunate as to have the tranquility of his heart destroyed by the sight of her dark and languishing eyes. From that time forward an image of the beautiful Julia was formed in his mind, whose contemplation absorbed him so that he thought of nothing else. Henceforth nothing but the thought of Julia had any attraction for him. He sought to woo and to win the ideal of his thoughts, but alas, his sighs and tears were all in vain, for his home was poor, and the proud Julia cared far more for money than for love. She knew that Burkhart's fortune was too small to supply her with all the luxuries she desired. Therefore, when he offered her his heart, she rejected it and sneeringly said, "Of what use will be your heart to me, if starvation waits for me in your home?" This offensive remark was more than a knight of these times was able to bear in patience, and Burkhart, cursing his poverty, went home in despair. From day to day he became more and more morose and melancholy, grieving on account of the insufficiency of his means. At last he determined to enrich himself by whatever means he might find, and resolved to rob the gnomes of the Untersberg of their treasures. In these times it was customary for almost everybody to have a wise and faithful steward ready to give good advice. Burkhart's steward did his best to dissuade the knight from this wicked and dangerous undertaking. But in vain did old Bruno, for this was his name, entreat him to desist from evil thoughts, and to forget the proud Julia, as she was entirely unworthy of his affection. The knight would not listen. "The Lord be merciful to you," exclaimed Bruno. "Shake off this delusion, O noble knight. Think of your high descent and what your ancestors would say. Look upwards, to where your salvation rests. The spirits of the lower world will mislead and ruin you." But the knight answered, "I am not a coward. I am not afraid of losing my life, which is worthless to me without the possession of Julia. More than once I have looked into the face of death while engaged in battle. I want the gold of the gnomes, and must have it, let the consequences be what they may. If the gnomes are not willing to surrender their gold, I shall take it by force." Thus spurning good advice, the knight gave orders that his black warhorse be brought forth. This he bestrode, and trotted towards the Untersberg. It was a gloomy evening in November. The leaves of the trees had turned yellow and red, and rustled in the wind, and their voices seemed to warn him not to proceed, while the waving boughs motioned to him to return. Soon the queen of the night began to spread her mantle over the face of the earth, and there arose in the gloom, like a gigantic shadow, the outlines of the mysterious Untersberg. For a moment fear overcame the youth, and he stopped. But his desire overcame his fear, and pronouncing an oath he spurred his horse, determined to push on. Just then the horse shied, and looking up, Burckhardt saw sitting by the roadside a dwarf clothed in a steel-blue gown. The dwarf looked steadily with glittering eyes at the knight. "Avaunt!" exclaimed Burckhardt angrily. "What are you sitting here and frightening my horse for?" "Ho, ho," laughed the dwarf. "No, you creeping worm of the earth, I am Pipo, the king of the gnomes. Mine is the Untersberg with its treasures. What have you to seek in my territory?" When Burckhardt heard these words, he deemed it prudent to speak politely to the king of the gnomes. He therefore explained to him his situation, and asked for the loan of a sum of money, for which he promised his everlasting gratitude. The king groaned. "Confound your gratitude," he said. "There would be plenty of wretches like you coming to borrow money from me, if it could be had at such a cheap price." "What then do you demand?" asked the knight. "State your terms, and I will accept them, for I must have gold at any price." "Listen then," said the gnome. "It is not much that I ask. Only 1 hair from your head for each 1,000 of florins." Thus saying, his eyes rested searchingly upon the face of the knight. "Only 1 hair from my head!" exclaimed Burckhardt in great astonishment. "A whole lot of hair you shall have, and be welcome, if you only furnish me the money necessary for obtaining the favor of Julia." "I am putting no limits to the amount you may draw," laughed the king. "For each 1,000 of florins which you receive from me, you will have to leave me 1 hair from your head." "It is a bargain," exclaimed the knight joyfully, and drawing his dagger, he was about to proceed to cut a lock of hair from his forehead to offer it to the king. "Not so," said Pipo. "Only 1 hair at a time, and I will have to pull it out myself by the root." So the knight dismounted, and as he bent down the dwarf tore a single hair from his scalp, after which he threw a bag of gold at Burckhardt's feet. "Thanks," exclaimed the knight, as he hugged the bag and gloated over its contents. "No thanks are wanted," replied the gnome. "See to it that the hairs upon your head will not become too few in time to purchase enough gold for satisfying the greed of your Julia." So saying, the gnome vanished, but the knight returned with his bag of gold to the castle. He now at once began to enlarge and improve his house in exquisite style. He bought costly furniture and ornaments, hired servants and cooks, sent out invitations for dinners and balls, and every evening he went to the Untersberg for another bag of gold, leaving in return 1 of his hairs. Soon the news of the riches of Burckhardt von Tallenstein began to spread, and everybody wondered and came to see and admire the luxury displayed by the knight. Now the consent of Julia was easily gained, and before many days the walls of the castle resounded with gay music, merrymaking, and laughter. For the marriage of the valorous knight with the beautiful countess took place. All the nobility in the country were invited, and took part in the revel. Henceforth the castle of Tallenstein became the scene of an uninterrupted succession of festivities of all kinds. There was a merry-go-round, and the doors of the house were open day and night to visitors. Parasites of all kinds peopled the castle. Dinners, dances, masquerades, tournaments, theatrical performances, and hunting excursions followed each other without end, and the beautiful Julia had the sweet satisfaction of being surrounded by flatterers and admirers to her heart's content. But her desires grew in proportion as they were gratified, her vanity in proportion as it was tickled. Her whims were incalculable, but the resources of her husband seemed to be inexhaustible, and he was an object of envy to everyone. More and more frequent grew his visits to the Untersberg, from each of which he returned with 1,000 florins in gold, but with one less hair from his head. And for all that, he seemed not to be happy, for he saw only too clearly that he had bought only the appearance of love, and that his wife loved not him but only his money. And whenever he did not at once comply with her unreasonable and extravagant demands, she would treat him with contempt, so as to render life a burden to him. All this caused him a great deal of grief, which he sought to drown in the wine cup. Thus he became at last a confirmed drunkard and an object of disgust. All the evil germs in his nature began to grow luxuriantly and to bear fruit. He became a weakling, a cruel tyrant towards his subjects, an abject coward in the presence of his wife, who treated him as if he were a slave. His troubles caused him to grow prematurely old, and the hair upon his head grew thinner from day to day. Thus a few years passed away in great misery, and at last poor Burckhardt was entirely bald-headed. The last florin was gone. But the Countess had ordered a great tournament and dinner, to which many noblemen and ladies of rank were invited. Once more Burckhardt went to the Untersberg for the purpose of asking the king of the gnomes for money, but no more hair did he have to give in return. The gnome appeared, and the knight, removing his helmet, showed him the deplorable condition of his scalp, hoping to arouse the pity of the king. "Ah, Burckhardt," exclaimed Pipo, "did I not tell you to beware that your hairs may not become too few?" "I now see my folly," sighed the knight. "But for pity's sake let me have only one more bag of gold, to save myself from disgrace." "Ha, ha," laughed the gnome. "Nothing brings nothing. No hair, no money. Our bargain is at an end." "Ask what you will," cried the knight, "but hair I have no more to give. Take my soul, but give me only one bag of money. Only one bag of gold I am asking of you." But in vain Burckhardt implored the gnome. Pipo was inexorable, and laughed at him. This exasperated Burckhardt, and becoming enraged, he cried, "Hellhound, you have completed your devilish work. With each hair that you took from my head you robbed me of a part of my manhood. Now I recognize you as the fiend that you are. Give me back my lost energy. Give me back the beautiful golden hair of which you have despoiled me by means of your accursed gold. Give it back to me, or look out for the revenge of the Tollensteins." But the gnome laughed. "Fool," he said, "do you wish to frighten me? Would you now curse the one from whom you received all that you wanted? I laugh at you and your threats. But if you wish your hair returned, be it so." So saying, the gnome drew forth a cord twisted from Burckhardt's hair, and threw it at the feet of the knight. He then disappeared within the depths of the Untersberg, while from all sides a mocking laughter shook the air, as if coming from a multitude of invisible spectators. But the knight went home and locked himself up in his bedroom. At the castle of Tollenstein everything was in readiness for the beginning of the great tournament. Knights in glittering armor and ladies in costly dresses were thronging the halls, while in the courtyard below richly decked steeds, attended by grooms in bright colors, neighed and stamped the ground, impatient for the opening of the sham fight, for the beginning of which nothing was now needed but the presence of the host. The trumpets sounded, but nothing was seen of Burckhardt. Repeatedly were messengers sent to his room, but they found the door locked and were not admitted. At last Julia, losing her patience, went up with clenched fists to inquire about the cause of this delay, but her knocks at the door elicited no reply. She therefore ordered the door to be forced open, and then a ghastly sight met her eyes. Burckhardt von Tollenstein was lying dead on his bed, his features distorted as if he had died in great agony. Around his neck was tied a cord of yellow human hair, with which he had been strangled. His eyes were protruding as if starting from their sockets, while his fingers were spasmodically closed around a bag containing 1,000 florins in gold. This was the end of the Tollensteins. And now the excuses for writing the following tale. If this story of Burckhardt of Tollenstein had never been exhumed from the archives containing the family histories of the ancient knights of the Duchy of Salzburg, the following chapters would never have been written, for it was the discovery of these reliable documents which recalled to my memory the history told to me by my now deceased friend, Mr. Schneider, who was himself a participant in the adventure which I am about to describe. It appears that, long after the death of Burkhard von Tallenstein, 3 very learned gentlemen, having heard of that story, arrived from some far-off country, presumably from the Dark Continent. Being of a very skeptical turn of mind, they did not believe in gnomes, and had undertaken their journey for the purpose of disproving the existence of the spirits of nature. They belonged to a scientific society whose object was the abolition of the supernatural, and to sober up mankind by drawing away their attention from all sorts of ideals, and bring them back to the dry and hard facts of material life. That society had already accomplished a great deal of important work. They had, by a certain system of logic, disproved the existence of God, spirit, and soul, and shown that all that is called life or consciousness is nothing else but the result of friction brought on by the mechanical motion of molecules of dead matter accidentally coming into contact with each other. The 3 gentlemen with whom we shall directly become acquainted were appointed by the Society for the Abolition of the Supernatural as a committee, for the purpose of giving the last death blow to the superstitious belief in spirits and gnomes, and arrived for that purpose. They were firmly determined that the belief in anything that could not be seen by means of corporeal eyes, or grasped with fingers of flesh, should be relegated into the garret, where antiquated superstitions are stowed away. After due consultation, these gentlemen resolved to make a scientific expedition to one of the caves of the Untersberg, reported to be haunted, and Mr. Schneider, being then a young and vigorous man, well acquainted with the topography of the mountain, was invited to accompany them. The excursion took place on the day preceding St. John's, it being the 23rd of June, but the date of the year escaped my memory. The adventures which Mr. Schneider experienced are told by him in the following pages. 2. In the Dragon's Den. About 1,000 feet below the summit of the Untersberg, and not very far from the top of one of its spurs, that reaches out into the valley through which runs the limpid stream coming from the renowned lake called the Koenigsee, there is a spacious cave, within an almost perpendicular slope of rocks, several hundred feet in height. This cave or hole, called the Dragon's Den, is large enough for affording shelter to a whole herd of cattle, and high enough so that a good-sized church, steeple and all, might be put therein. Its roof is formed by an overhanging rock, as is shown in our picture, and the whole extends like a tunnel from one side of the hill to the other, so that if seen from below it appears like an archway through which the sky and the stars on the other side may be seen. This den is said to have been inhabited in ancient times by a villainous dragon of a very peculiar kind, having no conscience, reason, or common sense, but being exceedingly selfish. His greatest pleasure was to dissect and analyze everything, and to destroy all that was of an ideal nature, to tear the clothes away from everything exalted and beautiful for the purpose of exposing bare facts. These he liked so well that he imagined the bones of every creature were its only essential parts, so he tore the flesh of his victims away and devoured their bones. From the altitude of his den he would overlook both sides of the hill, and whenever he saw a pretty maiden wandering among the rocks in search of the alpine rose or the edelweiss, he would pounce upon her, drag her to his den, dissect her, and strip her of all flesh, and devour the bones piece by piece. It is said that later on the dragon emigrated into the valley, but his den was selected by the Committee for the Investigation concerning the non-existence of gnomes. Before we proceed further, it will be necessary to introduce the reader to our friends. There was, first of all, Professor Thomas Cracker, a member of nearly all scientific societies in the world, a great skeptic, who, by a long course of scientifically training his imagination, had acquired such a degree of scientific skepticism that he always knew everything without taking the trouble of looking at it. There was no fact in nature for which he had not invented a theory, and if the theory did not fit it, so much the worse for the facts. He had become celebrated, because, owing to his superior sagacity and after years of persevering study, he had succeeded in discovering that a certain book entitled Little Alice in Wonderland was only a fable, not based upon historical facts, and whose object was to bamboozle the ignorant and take in unwary and gullible people. Owing to the great merit obtained by this work, the honor and title of a member of the Academy was bestowed upon him. Mr. Cracker's father had been the keeper of a variety shop, and was in the habit of ignoring and treating with contempt everything that was not of his own manufacture or kept in his shop. Nevertheless, among the good articles which he kept for sale, there were many things that had gone out of fashion. These he used to fit up in a new style, varnish and paint them over, give them new labels with modern names, and advertise them as something brand new. Thus he did a good trade and gained a reputation. Professor Cracker, Jr., resembled his father to a dot, only he traded in less tangible goods. He also was in the habit of ignoring and treating with contempt everything that did not agree with the theories that were manufactured by himself or his colleagues. Nevertheless, there were among his articles of creed certain doctrines taught centuries ago, but having gone out of fashion. These he used to take down from the garret where they had been forgotten, dress them up in modern style, varnish them over with modern expressions, label them with newly invented names, and advertise them as brand new discoveries, or goods of his own invention. In this way, Professor Cracker traded in science and gained a reputation. The next was the Reverend Jeremiah Stiffbone, a clergyman, who had received from his congregation a liberal amount of money to enable him to travel in search of the truth that could not be found at home. Mr. Stiffbone was well versed in all sorts of authorities, and able to quote almost any number of books in support of almost any opinion, for he knew the contents of many scientific and religious writings, that is to say, he knew what was written therein. But as to his knowledge in regard to the subjects themselves, it would be difficult to decide what it was, for he one day believed in this, and the next day in another author's veracity, and the one into whom he put his faith was for the time, being to him the only infallible one. Thus he stumbled along upon the path of wisdom, falling from one opinion into another like a person in a state of intoxication. It should not be supposed, however, that Jeremiah loved this state of uncertainty and wavering. What he wanted, above all, was to establish a scientific and religious system that could be fully depended on as being true and reliable, and containing articles and scientific doctrines which everyone would have to accept as true, and go to sleep quietly, being firmly convinced that the opinions therein were the final dictates of science, incontrovertible, not subject to improvement, and fully correct. As to the external appearance of the above-named two gentlemen, Professor Cracker was of short stature, thickly set, with a rubicund face, smoothly shaven, except a pair of gray side whiskers. His little eyes continually wandered restlessly from one object to another. His arms were unusually long, but his legs short and bow-shaped, and all this somehow contributed to give him the appearance of a mandrill, cynocephaly maimon, as may be said without giving offense to the professor, for he was himself firmly of the opinion that the whole of man had descended from the ape. He even looked with satisfaction upon his long line of ancestors, and prided himself on having become somehow superior to them in the art of reasoning, if not in bodily strength. As to the Reverend Stiffbone, he seemed the reverse of Professor Cracker. He was thin and tall, looking like a collection of bones of some antediluvian bird. His features were sharp, his head almost bald, and his mouth wide, while his chin and nose were long and protruding, as if they were trying to meet each other. Upon his nose he wore a pair of green goggles of great size, causing him to appear not unlike an owl, but his nose and chin gave him a resemblance to one of the well-known wooden nutcrackers, which are manufactured in the city of Nuremberg and are the delight of the children all over the world. Finally, there was Moses Abraham Scalawag, ESQ, the commercial business manager of the expedition. His external appearance went to show that he was not much of an idealist, but preferred the good and material things of this life, and had no aversion to a certain kind in spirits. Although he denounced the belief in hobgoblins, ghosts, gnomes, etc., as a degraded superstition, he somehow thought that, if the story of Burkhard von Tallenstein were true, it might be worth the while to investigate the financial condition of the gnomes in the Untersberg. We were accompanied by a guide, carrying our provisions and scientific instruments. This guide was a direct descendant of the reputed Lazarus Gichner, who in the year 1529 spent 10 days among the gnomes in the Untersberg. We attempted to draw him out, but the guide would not reveal what his ancestor had seen during that visit. Nor is this surprising, for Lazarus himself never revealed it to anybody except to the priest in the confessional. All that has become known about it is that he came out of the Untersberg a man entirely changed from what he was before he went in, and the priest also, after hearing the confession, became very much changed himself, even so that he left off playing ninepins on Sunday morning, led a retired life, and died not long afterwards in the odor of sanctity. Bright was the day, and the earth looked refreshed from the morning dew that still rested upon the daffodils and ferns, where it glittered in the light of the sun like so many small diamonds. The air was fragrant from the odor of pines and wild thyme, and the breeze carried up from the valley an aroma of new-mown hay. Peacefully grazed the goats upon the sides of a hill, from which rushed a small cataract in 1,000 cascades, while an air of tranquility and solemnity rested upon the scene below, interrupted only by the tolling of the bell in the distant village church, which sounded harmoniously into the solitude. Of all this, however, our members of the committee saw, heard, smelt, and knew nothing, for each was absorbed in his own thoughts. Professor Cracker moved slowly on, carrying his wig on his walking stick over his shoulder, and reveling in the anticipation of the glory which the annihilation of the gnome theory would bring upon him. The Reverend Stiffbones' long coat-tails fluttered in the wind as he marched on, taking long strides upon the uneven path, and his thoughts were absorbed in the prospect of being able to add another incontrovertible doctrine in regard to the non-existing of gnomes to his Bible of Science. Mr. Scalawag wobbled along as well as he could, thinking nothing particular, but stopping frequently and wiping the sweat from his brow. At last he exclaimed, "Confound these gnomes! Is it worth the while to climb up to that den and waste our valuable time in disproving that such animals exist?" To this the Reverend Stiffbone replied, "Gnomes are not animals, but imaginary beings." Theophrastus Paracelsus describes them as being intellectual forces in nature, whatever that may mean. They are about 6 inches in height, but able to change and to elongate their bodies. "But how can you determine their height?" asked Mr. Scalawag, "if they are merely imaginary? You may just as well imagine them to be 1,000 feet, if you try." "Rot!" interrupted Professor Cracker, for that was his favorite impression whenever anything was mentioned that was unknown to him. "Rot! There are no such things as intelligent forces of nature, neither imaginary ones nor others. This degrading superstition has now lasted long enough, and this day will make an end to such vagaries." "Are you then firmly convinced," asked Mr. Scalawag, rather dejectedly, "that the treasures of the gnomes in the Untersberg do not exist?" "They exist only in the imagination of fools," replied the professor. "There can be no such thing as a spirit, as I shall demonstrate to you today by means of my new spiritoscope." "It is strange," now remarked the Reverend Stiffbone, "that there are still some respectable authorities favoring such a superstitious belief. Even the Bible mentions the existence of spirits in more than one instance." "Rot," replied the professor. "There is no theory so absurd that it may not find admirers among otherwise intelligent people. Only think of the many fools who imagine it to be possible to make cars that are pulled by steam." "Do you then believe it to be absolutely impossible to make railways?" asked Mr. Scalawag. "Railways!" sneeringly exclaimed Cracker. "Rot! No man in his sane senses would ever think of such a thing. Steam can blow, but it cannot pull cars. If a steam engine were invented, it would scald everybody to death. As to those eccentric and fanatical people who now fancy it possible to make a railway between Manchester and Liverpool, I have only to say that we, the scientists of this century, decline to waste our time in examining such wild and extravagant schemes. Even if the tales told in some of the newspapers were true, instead of being deplorable vagaries, and if it were possible to invent such an engine, it would not interest us, for surely nobody would be insane enough to trust his life and his safety to an engine going at the terrible speed of 16 miles an hour. No, my dear sir. To make a railway is as impossible as that stones should fall from heaven, the reason of which impossibility the Academy of Science has pointed out, namely, because there are no stones in the sky. It may be observed that this conversation took place before the time when meteors were known and railways in action. At the present time, such a display of scientific ignorance would of course be impossible. Suppose, said the Reverend Stiffbone, we admit for argument's sake that a railway could be made on a level plain. What would they do if they were to come to a mountain? They would have to dig a hole through it, pass through it in the dark, and coming out at the other end the passengers would suddenly emerge into the light. This sudden change would undoubtedly strike them blind. Undoubtedly it would, added Professor Cracker, unless they were to wear traveling goggles for protection. You may, however, rest assured that, if railways could be made, we would have discovered it long ago. And the same may be said in regard to gnomes, ghosts, spirits, or intelligent forces of any kind. If there were such things, we would know it. How is it then possible, I asked, that the ancient philosophers believed such things? To a layman like you, answered the professor, such a question may be pardoned. The ancient philosophers were fools. They did not know as much as one of our schoolboys knows today. As to Lord Lytton, Goethe, and other more modern writers who spoke of such things, they only did so because they loved to make jokes for the amusement of the wise, and to have some fun at the expense of the gullible. We know that spirit without matter does not exist. Matter is visible. Consequently, the spirits would have to possess visible forms. We also know that no kind of living beings can exist within solid rocks, where they would be without water and air, and finally, if there were any intelligent forces in nature, they would know the importance of coming forward and proving their existence to men of science. I remarked that a belief in gnomes was quite common in this country, and asked whether this could be explained. Ridiculously easy, said the professor. The sources of error are inherited idiosyncrasies, a want of scientific training in making observations, subjective, objective, and epidemic hallucinations, credulity, hysteria, suggestion, dreams, hypnotism, post-hypnotic autosuggestion, and so forth. Nevertheless, I objected. There are those who have been touched by gnomes, have seen and conversed with them, received tangible objects from them.
Rot, replied Cracker.
It is all due to willful deception, humbug, swindle, trumpery, fraud, plagiarism, coincidence, telepathic impact, thought transfer, unconscious cerebration, mediumship, sympathetic association of ideas, etc. Only recently I have discovered, after making a long research and consulting many authorities, that the accounts given in Gulliver's Travels were not based upon historical facts, but are only the products of the imagination of the author, who for thus imposing upon the credulity of the public, must be regarded as being one of the greatest cheats of his age. Fetch me a spirit or gnome, and let me dissect it to see of what it is made. Unless you do so, I say that it is nothing but rot, the product of the disordered fancy of a scientifically untrained brain. I did not quite agree with Cracker's views, and I therefore said, I believe that there are still people capable of telling a pigtail from a broomstick without dissecting it and having it certified to by a professor of science. Cracker and Stiffbone exchanged an ominous look. This, said Stiffbone, comes from the increased disrespect for the authorities. Nowadays, everybody imagines that he has a right to think and say what he pleases. It is time that a law ought to be made punishing heresy in science, as it used to be punished in regard to religion. Not long ago I heard a new heresy preached about what they call conservation of energy. Men ought not to be permitted to go about and poison the minds of the public by spreading erroneous scientific doctrines. We absolutely need a Bible of science, stating exactly what scientific beliefs the people are to accept. Such a book, answered the professor, would be of the greatest benefit to the world and prevent the injurious and misleading self-thinking done by laymen and ignorant tramps. What business have the common people to do their own thinking? No one ever attempts to make his own shoes or clothes, but leaves this to his shoemaker or tailor, who can do it much better, cheaper, and quicker than he could do it himself. Why not apply the same system to deciding scientific or religious questions? Let the thinking in regard to such things be left to those who are trained and entitled to it. With these views, the Reverend Stiffbone fully agreed. Science, he said, ought to be left to the scientists, religion to the clergy, morality to the police, medicine to the physicians, money matters to bankers, and ideal things to legally appointed idealists. This would enable the people to give more attention to their own material interests. Instead of thinking about things which bring them no profit, they might employ their time for useful things, such as the raising of hogs. Religion ought not to be neglected, for the fear of the devil is the security of the church. But one authentic sermon printed and posted every Sunday in public places would save the employment of an army of preachers, and moreover secure conformity to the doctrines taught everywhere. If the people must have music, 1 or 2 organ grinders would be enough for a town of no more than 1,000 inhabitants. If they wanted poetry, one well-trained and diplomatized verse-maker could supply the whole country. These questions, said M. Scalawag, ESQ, deserve the most careful consideration. Time is money. The struggle for existence is the first law among all beings. The survival of the fittest its necessary result. Let everyone take as much care as he can of his own interest, and leave it to those who are appointed for that purpose to look out for the rest. We are appointed for that, exclaimed Professor Cracker, and we will attend to it. I have just discovered a new system of hypnotism by means of which large crowds can be hypnotized at once. Instead of sending the children to school, we will hypnotize into their heads all that we want them to know, and cause them to post-hypnotically forget all which we do not wish them to remember. Thus we will be the kings of the world, and all mankind will dance as we pull the strings. While carrying on these discussions, we arrived at the Dragon's Den, where our investigations were to begin. The place showed no indication of the presence of spirit. There was nothing dismal about it. On the contrary, an air of peace seemed to rest upon the scene. At the entrance of the cave there was a wild rosebush of considerable size and some alpine flowers, among which I noticed the larkspur and belladonna. The walls consisted of marble rocks, exhibiting a variety of colors, and were covered in some places with mosses and ferns. In a shady corner there was still a remnant of snow, resembling a miniature glacier and rendering the air cool and pleasant. The 2 openings at the sides offered a magnificent view. The guide, who had remained a little behind, as his movements were greatly impeded by the legs of Professor Cracker's spiritoscope, which he carried, now arrived with his bag of provisions and unpacked his treasures. Cold meats, poultry and cheese, ham and eggs, butter and bread, made their appearance and were soon disposed of by the committee. Beer and wine had not been forgotten, and Professor Cracker, filling his glass with champagne, lifted it up and offered a toast to the annihilation of the gnomes, which was followed by another toast, pronounced by Jeremiah Stiffbone, to Professor Cracker, the king of science and inventor of the spiritoscope, while Mr. Scalawag, in offering his sentiments, said he hoped to find some of the treasures of the Untersberg. After the refreshments were taken, the investigations began. To begin with, the committee carefully examined the rocks and walls and every nook and corner of the Dragon's Den, for the purpose of convincing themselves that there was no place where anybody might hide himself and play a practical joke upon the investigators. They measured the size of the rocks and made sure of their solidity and the entire absence of any subterranean caves or holes. The floor was found to be perfectly solid, and no gnomes were to be seen. Thereupon they carefully noted the hour and the minute, as is always necessary on such occasions, and evidence was taken that the sky was clear. The direction of the wind was determined with great accuracy and found to be E&E. The temperature was taken and the various thermometers indicated 25 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Romer, and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The barometer showed an elevation of 5,800 feet above the sea and a medium atmospheric pressure. No gnome or spirit of any kind appeared upon the scene, nor was there to be found anything whatever of a spiritual character. After all the necessary preparations were made, Professor Cracker produced his spiritoscope, whose description we are permitted to give for the benefit of all psychical researchers, and as a boon to the whole of mankind. Dr. Cracker's spiritoscope. This ingeniously constructed and very simple, although somewhat ponderous instrument was the original invention of Professor Cracker and enabled him, instead of directly looking at an object, to behold and examine it by means of a series of reflections produced by 4 scientifically arranged mirrors bent towards each other at angles of 45 degrees. The main body of the instrument consisted of a wooden box in which the 4 above-named mirrors were placed so as to face each other, and to the box was attached a telescope tube. Thus a ray of light coming from an outside object and entering the box would produce an image in the first mirror. This would become reflected in the second and third, and finally in the fourth, where it could be seen through the telescope. The whole apparatus was mounted upon a tripod with movable legs, so that it could be turned in every direction. It will naturally be asked, how could Professor Cracker expect by such natural means to discover anything supernatural? And what is the benefit of looking at the reflection of a thing in a mirror, if it might be just as well seen directly with the eye? As to the first question, Professor Cracker did not admit the existence of anything beyond the common aspect of nature, and needed therefore no instrument for its discovery. While in regard to the second question, he said that direct vision was unscientific and unreliable, because what a man sees, or believes to see, may be caused by irregular cerebral action, hallucination, defective sight, ecstasy, trance, clairvoyance, or other diseases. But mirrors could not be deceived. They would not become hallucinated or enter into a state of ecstasy. They only showed what was actually true, and there was no humbug about them. Direct sight was well enough for common people with common sense, but indirect vision for science. Heretofore the great merit of this spiritoscope was, as Professor Cracker repeatedly pointed out, that it had never produced any other than negative results, but these had been obtained unfailingly on all occasions, for it had actually never indicated the presence of any genius, gnome, ghost, or spirit whatever. But as the instrument was constructed according to unquestionable principles, these negative results were fully sufficient to prove the correctness of Professor Cracker's theory. On this occasion, however, there seemed to be something the matter with the spiritoscope. Be it that the mirrors were not in order, or that even scientific and indirect vision may be deceptive, there was evidently some kind of an obscuration within the tube, which could not be explained by natural causes. In vain Professor Cracker repeatedly cleaned his spectacles, and ultimately substituted colored glasses for them. The fact was undeniable that something dark, some sort of a shadow, appeared repeatedly within the field of indirect vision, and this something must have been alive, for it moved about by means of some energy contained within itself, and without being kinetically impelled by any discoverable extraneous force. Repeatedly the professor exclaimed the ominous word, rot, and bosh, and impossible. His skepticism had to give way before the evidence produced by his spiritoscope, and at last he was overcome by the conviction of having discovered a gnome. He looked somewhat pale, as with bated breath and with ill-suppressed excitement he announced the discovery to his colleagues. It was now Reverend Stiffbones' turn to take a look through the spiritoscope. He, too, saw the shadow and saw it move. Owing to the circumstance that the light fell into the instrument from the side opposed to the standpoint of the observer, the part of the spirit turned towards Stiffbones I could not be clearly seen, but its outline seemed to grow sometimes larger and sometimes smaller, from which he inferred that the spirit was a gnome, as they were said to be able to change the size of their forms. These observations were corroborated by Mr. Scalawag. Professor Cracker looked again, and having satisfied himself that there could be no possible mistake, he made a speech, in which he said that it had been reserved for him to make the greatest discovery of this age, and that the existence of gnomes, which had heretofore been doubted by certain too skeptical people, was now an established fact, demonstrated by him for the first time in human history. But alas, this world is but a fleeting show, and even the demonstrations of science cannot always be depended upon as absolutely true, for while the professor made his speech, the head of a little mouse appeared at the opening of the tube, and seeing the coast clear, the mouse jumped to the ground and ran away. How the mouse happened to come into the spiritoscope has never been satisfactorily explained. The committee looked perplexed, and Cracker grew red in the face. "Errare humanum est," exclaimed Stiffbone, and Mr. Scalawag added, "We are all liars. The best plan will be to say nothing about it." Although the committee did not believe thenceforth in spirits, it can nevertheless not be denied that a spirit of gloom rested upon them after this incident. A scowl rested upon the professor's face, and he admitted that for once in his life he had been mistaken. While they discussed this matter, the wind had changed from eeny to in, and now a light puff of air brought a piece of paper flying into the cave. Reverend Stiffbone saw it, and picked it up. There were written upon it the following verses. "O foolish mortal, by dull senses bound, within thyself the spirit must be found. Know thou thyself, and by self-knowledge know the lives above and in the world below. In every sphere each being knows its own. To spirits only spirits can be shown." After reading these lines, Mr. Stiffbone handed the paper to the professor and asked him what he thought. The professor carefully examined the structure of the paper and said, "This is nothing but an ordinary piece of notepaper manufactured in this country. There is nothing supernatural about it." "But the verses," answered Stiffbone, "they seem to refer to the subject of our conversation. How is this coincidence to be explained?" "In a very simple manner," replied Professor Cracker, growing more and more excited as he spoke. "You, sir, have written these miserable verses yourself for the purpose of playing it on me. But let me assure you that, even if I have been imposed on by a mouse, I am not going to be fooled by such a ragamuffin as yourself. Your trick was not clever enough for that." During this speech, the Reverend Stiffbone, with open mouth, stared aghast at the professor, and the word ragamuffin aroused his temper. He said that such an ill-founded accusation was calculated to greatly lessen his respect for one whose capacity to judge he had anyhow always regarded as doubtful, and that he owed it to his own respectability as a clergyman to regard Mr. Cracker's calumnies as being those of a man in his dotage, if not a willful perverter of truth. Cracker retorted again, and it is doubtful how the matter would have ended, but just at that moment a long-drawn sigh was heard, coming from some invisible source, and at the next moment a gust of wind followed that overthrew the spiritoscope and sent Stiffbone's hat flying out at the other end of the dragon's den. Directly afterwards the cave became illumined by a flash of lightning, and this was succeeded by a clap of thunder which caused the ground to tremble and reverberated like the firing of a battery of guns through the clefts in the neighborhood. The committee stood aghast and terrified, looking at each other in a perplexed manner and not knowing what to do. It appears that the sky had become suddenly overcast with clouds, and a storm gathered at the top of the Untersberg, while our friends were too much absorbed in their scientific researches to notice it, and now the rain began to come down in torrents, and the archway offered but little protection, for sheets of rain were blown in at the open side of the cave, and streams of water began to flow in every direction over the ground. In a few moments the members of the committee and myself were drenched to the skin, and did not know what to begin. But our guide, drawing aside the branches of the rose bush that stood at the entrance, pointed out to us an excavation in the rock, which had escaped the observation of the committee, and he invited us to enter. Into this hole we crawled one after another, and after proceeding a few feet it grew wider, and formed a hollow of considerable size. Here we were comfortable enough, only we were wet, and the place was perfectly dark. Professor Cracker struck a light, and lit a candle which he happened to have in his pocket, and by that aid we discovered a passage leading still further into the interior of the hill. This we decided to explore. Professor Cracker entered with his candle, then came Reverend Stiffbone, after him Mr. Scalawag, and finally myself, each man holding on to the coat-tail of the one who preceded. Thus we went on for a considerable distance, when suddenly a draught of cold air blew out the professor's light. At the same time Mr. Cracker's foot hit against some soft elastic substance of an unknowable kind, and directly afterwards he received a fearful blow upon his abdomen from something unseen. Turning round for escaping the invisible enemy, he received another blow that sent him flying heels overhead, overturning the Reverend Stiffbone, who in his turn upset Mr. Scalawag. They were all lying in a heap, and I heard Cracker's voice producing a series of most unearthly yells. But the Rev. Stiffbone, while begging for mercy and blindly grasping about, clutched the air and got hold of Mr. Scalawag's hair, who defended himself with his fists. But my observations were also cut short, for I had just time, as my eyes became accustomed to the darkness, to see a still darker object rushing at me over the prostrate forms of my friends, when I myself received a severe blow upon my stomach that caused me to lose my senses, and for a moment I knew nothing more. 3. Within the Untersberg. It seems that during the consternation caused by this event, I must have unconsciously wandered off, for when I gathered my senses again, I found myself in a strange labyrinth of rocks. In vain I tried to find my way back to the dragon's den. There were perpendicular walls and precipices encompassing me on all sides, and the only outlet which I discovered led me still higher up towards the main body of the Untersberg. The storm clouds had disappeared and the sky was clear, But my mind, if there is such a thing, was somewhat confused. I did not know which was which. Owing to Professor Cracker's exposition about the unreliability of direct vision, I could not tell whether the things around me were actually there, or whether they were merely the products of autosuggestion, trumpery, etc. More than once I bumped my head against a projecting rock, because my method of observation was not scientifically trained enough to enable me to realize the actuality of the rock without a knockdown argument. I had always fancied before that if one receives an impression from an object, be it in the waking state or in a dream, an object or image of some kind must be actually present, from which that impression comes. But now I saw that, according to science, impressions may come from nothing and may be only the products of the accidental friction of brain molecules. I was therefore no longer sure of the existence of anything that had not been analyzed and attested to by a scientific expert. It seemed to me that the sun was about to set, and that I was still wandering on, querying whether I actually was myself, or whether some gnome was playing a trick upon my imagination, making me believe that I was I. There was nothing to prove to me scientifically that the something or nothing which imagined itself to be myself was not something else, entirely unknown to me, provided there was such a thing as myself at all, which seemed rather doubtful, it having not yet been analyzed and its composition shown. I can, in truth, only say that something which somehow seemed to be myself, but to whom it seemed so, I do not know, imagined itself to be I. But for all I know, there may be no I, and it may have been nothing but space. It seemed to me, or to something, that the setting sun was gilding the ice fields of the neighboring mountain peaks with floods of light, and I, or something, received or seemed to receive the impression somehow that tints of various hues, beginning with a dainty rose color, followed by orange, yellow, sea green, and ending with blue, were adorning the sky, if there was any, while clouds, apparently floating within the depths of space, whose existence has not yet been proved scientifically, seemed to appear like fleecy masses of pure silver, lined with fluid gold. The vegetation, provided that there actually was one, appeared to be more scanty than below, and to consist mainly of clusters of rhododendron, and occasionally a specimen of mandrake, gentian, or thyme was to be seen or imagined. Judging from certain impressions, which something that seemed to be myself appeared to receive, I seemed to arrive at the conclusion that there were rocks covered with green moss, upon which grew various ferns and some ericas. Tranquility somehow seemed to reign supreme in this altitude, although this is a mere assertion, which I am not prepared to prove, and I seemed to perceive nothing which could have led anyone to infer that the stillness was in any way interrupted, except by the song of a finch that was sitting or appeared to sit upon the branch of a tree, always supposing that the tree was actually there, and the croaking of a flock of ravens, which were flying, or seemed to be flying around the tops of the Untersberg. I say all this with a certain reserve, and confess myself unable to prove it, because direct vision is unreliable, and I had no spiritoscope at my command. I say that all this seemed, to whom, to be as described, but even this is not scientifically exact or correct. For not knowing myself, how could I have the cheek to assert that I actually perceived anything, or nothing, or everything? How could I make any exact statement about myself if I am not acquainted with myself, and do not know whether or not I exist? I love to be scientifically exact in my statements, and to avoid making wild assertions. I wish, or imagine to wish, to express myself in a manner leaving no room for the learned critic to misunderstand or misinterpret my words, and to speak so plainly that everybody must necessarily understand what I mean. But I find that this philosophical and roundabout way of describing things is very inconvenient, and that for the reader's own sake I cannot persevere in it. Everything in this world seems to be only relatively true, and if we were bound to speak nothing but absolute truth, and express it in a manner that could not possibly be misunderstood by anybody, we would surely be doomed to eternal silence. I must therefore ask the permission of the reader to depart from this exact and strictly scientific method of speaking and circumscribing, and to do like people of common sense, and tell what I experienced or believed to experience, as if I were really something whose existence had been proved and recognized by science, even if I have no other proof of my existence to offer, except that I am. This being myself is a reality to me, but it may be discredited by another. For there can be nothing real to anybody except what he or she realizes, and if they realize it, it is, or seems to be, real to them. During my visit in the Untersberg, I realized my existence, or seemed to realize it just as much as at any other time in my life, always provided that I exist and live. And the experiences through which I passed were just as real to me as any other experiences before or after that event. Let those who doubt my words, or deny the possibility of what I describe as having occurred, doubt or deny to their heart's content. They cannot rob me of the satisfaction of knowing what I know. Somehow I felt myself more free than usual. My body moved without experiencing any fatigue, and I seemed to have no weight. Owing, perhaps, to the invigorating influence of the mountain air, I felt myself filled with strength. My mind was tranquil, my heart full of joy, one. And, as it were, one with the spirit of all nature, if I may be permitted to use such an expression, and it may be for this reason that I understood the language of nature as plainly as if it had been expressed in audible words, for the rushing of a distant waterfall spoke to me of eternal motion, the presence of the earth, of the substantiality of the universe, nourishing all things, the wide expanse of the air of universal freedom, and the fiery orb of the sinking sun of an universal consciousness whose existence cannot be proved, but which may be experienced by souls that are free. Even the flowers had a language of their own, speaking to me of purity, beauty, modesty, and similar principles unknown to modern science, and not yet analyzed and classified. As I scrambled on, the scenery grew more wild. Huge boulders of enormous size often blocked the way, throwing fantastic shadows upon the ground. Slowly the sun disappeared behind the slopes of the western range, and solitary stars began to glitter here and there in the sky. The song of the finch had ceased, and the ravens gone to roost among the tops of the pines. But the more all animated things became silent and quiet, the more seemed life to become active in those things which are called inanimate. It was as if the inner life of nature awakened while the outward life went to rest. There is a voice that speaks to the soul in the stillness of night with words that are not to be found in the dictionary. Of course, Professor Cracker would surely call this an hallucination or lie, but for all that, I know it to be true. The boulders around me looked like gigantic sentinels guarding the entrance to the kingdom of the gnomes, and asking me in their own language by what right I dared to enter upon the forbidden precinct. Here and there the trunk of a stunted tree, a larch or fir with crooked boughs, added to the grotesqueness of the picture, complaining to me bitterly in silent but nevertheless eloquent words that the soil in that place was too poor and the climate too rough to permit a full development of its qualities and a luxuriant evolution of form. At last I stood before a wall of rocks, at the bottom of which a dark cavern held its jaws permanently open, and a feeling of curiosity attracted me towards the entrance. I felt a sort of premonition that the mysterious depths of that cavern was holding for me a new revelation. 2. The night had now fairly set in, but the moon arose in her glory. It was, as already stated, the eve of St. John's Day, when fairies and elves are said to come nearer to our world to hold intercourse with mortals. The mysterious night, when the ruby spark in the heart of the fern may be seen. A feeling of awe came over me as I looked into the cave and saw the silvery rays of the rising moon shining through the opening, revealing within the interior a lake of considerable extent. I went nearer, and now I beheld, as far as I could see, perpendicular rocks bordering the lake, with projecting nooks, holes, and crevices of unknown extent, while, from the vaulted roofs, appearing like huge stalactites of curious shapes, a curtain of icicles descended, and the surface of the water glittered and sparkled in the moonlight, and the grotto looked like the cave of the nymphs in a fairy tale. I strained my eyes to behold the further end of the lake, but the background was veiled in darkness, and my sight could not penetrate through the mysterious gloom. Something seemed to draw my soul towards the realm of that shadow which the rays of the moon could not reach, and as I stood listening, a soft melody was wafted over the waters. Was it the breeze causing a rippling upon the surface which produced that melodious sound while playing among the icicles, or was it the rhythmic dripping of drops of water from the vault overhead, causing faint echoes within these secret recesses? I cannot tell, but it seemed to me like a tiny voice of a woman, but of a woman of some ethereal kind. The melody seemed to express a longing for something unknown. It was like the cry of a newborn soul, desiring to live and exist. Point 3. It seems to me an impossibility to fully express in words the sentiments that were embodied in that song. It contained a desire for death or transformation, terms which mean the same thing, namely, the abandoning one state of existence for another one. It embodied a wish for entering upon a higher plane of life and consciousness. The melody which I heard formed itself into a language, whose meaning may perhaps be approximately expressed in the following words. Oh, what is this secret longing, welling up within my heart? Unknown powers, surging, thronging, rending solid rocks apart. Newborn joys and dying sadness, bursting clouds and opening sight. Something whispers, full of gladness, this is love, is life and light. These words formed themselves within myself without any conscious volition or ratiocination of my own. And, what is still more surprising, they had a certain magical effect upon me. I felt as if I were myself entering into a new state of consciousness, such as I never experienced before or afterwards, and as if I had become a new being, endowed with a new kind of perception and memory. It was as if I had been asleep all my life and suddenly awakened for the first time. I now somehow knew that I was I, but I could dissect or analyze myself. I knew that myself was a unity and not a compound, and therefore incapable of being taken to pieces. I had never known it before, and knew of no authority on whose strength I would have accepted that theory. Nevertheless, I was certain of it, because I found that my self-consciousness was not composed of parts. And lo, as I stood at the border of that lake, bending forwards, and with all my senses on the alert listening to the song, I saw a radiance within the depths of that darkness, issuing from a circular luminous center. And as I concentrated all my attention upon it, this light grew brighter, and there appeared in it the shape of a human being, a woman of supernatural beauty, in a mist-like, silvery garment dotted with stars. Her long golden hair was flowing over her shoulders, and a radiant light shone upon her forehead. It was that light, issuing, as I found afterwards, from a precious gem, which illuminated her person and all the objects within its sphere. I dislike to tell what followed, because I have no means of demonstrating its truth, and there will be undoubtedly many inclined to doubt it or to dispute it away. But if I had to give evidence before a notary public, I could not describe what followed otherwise than by saying that I was filled with an irresistible desire to approach that ethereal being, and that I made a step forward, quite without being aware that I was stepping upon a lake. To my surprise, the water supported me, and I now think that it must have been solid ice, for I passed safely over it, and a moment afterwards I stood in mute admiration before the most charming apparition of a lady of noble mien. The lady of the lake looked at me with wondering eyes and smiled. This encouraged me, so I said, "Who are you, angelic being? If you will permit an intruder this question, are you one of the angels of heaven or a spirit of nature?" "My name is Adalga," answered the lady, and her voice sounded like the music of the spheres. "I am the daughter of Bimbamai, king of the gnomes. But what are you? Are you a spirit, hobgoblin, or spook?" "I am neither the one nor the other," I answered. "I am—" But at this moment I could not for the sake of my life remember who or what I was. I had entirely forgotten my name and all that referred to my past life. At last, while I was trying hard to remember who I was, it suddenly dawned upon me that I was an Irishman, born near the lakes of Killarney and living at Limerick. I am sure that if I ever was an Irishman, it must have been before I was born, but at that moment I was quite certain of it and remembered my home and my family. I therefore said, "I am Patrick Mulligan, ESQ, if it pleases your worship." "There is a great deal of power in that name," replied the princess. But what is your essential nature? A tailor, if you please, was my answer. But seeing that the lady did not understand what I meant, I explained that I was in the habit of making clothes. Upon this, she asked, "Are you, then, one of these semi-intelligent forces of nature capable of assuming a form, which according to our traditions are believed to inhabit the solid vastness of the element called the air? One of these airy elementals whose bodies are subject to change, mischievous beings that often cause explosions in our minds?" The princess stared at me and I stared at her. What she said about the solid vastnesses of the air was incomprehensible to me, until I found out later on that the element of the air is just as impenetrable to the gnomes as the earth is to us. But what astonished me most was that after having doubted the existence of elemental spirits of nature, I now found myself by one of them regarded as an elemental spirit of the air. At last I said, "With your permission, I flatter myself to be somewhat more than semi-intelligent, and if I am a force, I am surely a substantial one. The fact is that I am a man, a member of the human family, a gentleman from the ancient kingdom of Ireland and a descendant of Caoba, the 123rd king of Ulster." "A man, a gentleman?" exclaimed the princess, full of astonishment and surprise, as if it was the most unheard of thing that one should be a man, and as if men and gentlemen were not much more plentiful in our world than gnomes and ghosts. This rather amused me, and I said to the princess, "I hope that I did not give offense to your honor. It seems that you are leading a very retired life, as you have never seen a man." But the princess paid little attention to what I said. Looking at me with her eyes wide open, she repeated, as if trying to persuade herself, "A man? Of course a man," said I. "What else could I be? I have been told of the existence of such superior beings," at last said the princess. "Our sages teach that they belong to a now extinct race of divine or semi-divine beings who were kings of creation and to whom all the laws of nature were subservient. They were said to be gods, and even superior to the gods in wisdom and power, and that they were spirits who sometimes assumed material bodies for the purpose of studying the conditions of the lower kingdom of matter." My vanity became excited by the description which the princess made of aboriginal man, and I did not wish to depreciate the good opinion which she had formed of me, so I merely nodded consent. "And from what region of the wide empyrean have you descended?" continued the princess, folding her hands, as if filled with admiration and reverence. "It is from Limerick that I come," was my answer. "I have never heard of that region of space," said the princess, "nor did I ever see any of the immortal beings who inhabit that sphere. But it is sufficient for me to know that you are a man, and that I am permitted to worship you. My love to you is unbounded. All that I am belongs to you. To become united with you forever is my only desire. Let me adore you. In you I shall find eternal life." No words can express the looks of love and affection which the princess bestowed upon me while her rosy lips expressed these sentiments, and she sank down before me in an attitude of worship. I at once thought that there must be a mistake somewhere, and that she took me for something higher than I knew myself to be, but I did not wish to disappoint her. The straightforwardness of the princess in speaking out her sentiments in plain language, and without any mock modesty, delighted me very much. I then did not know that this was originally a natural quality of the gnomes, who, being themselves born out of emotions, cannot disguise the emotions which cause them to live. So I replied, "I highly appreciate your condescension, madam. I do not doubt the sincerity of your words, and as I am fortunately not a married man, there is no objection to our entering into very friendly and intimate relations with each other." I do not know whether or not the princess understood what I said, but she continued to indulge in her expressions of love and admiration. Bending low and extending her beautiful white arms towards me, she cried out in rapture, "Let me worship thee, O self-born, self-existent one, thee who was before the world came into existence, and who will remain what he is even if all things perish. Thou, who knowest no death, let me embrace thee, and become one with thy divine nature. Let me hail thee, O Son of wisdom and Lord of creation, whose kingdom encompasses the sky, the earth, and the whole universe, whose self includes and penetrates all, to whom all power belongs and all glory is due. O infinite one, Having shown thyself to me in a limited form, let me dissolve in the infinitude of thy being. Tell me, O man, how I may serve thee." I was very much puzzled by this speech, and somehow felt that I did not deserve it. I had never known myself to be such a superior being as the princess described, but I saw that she was happy in her delusion, which afforded me a good opportunity to get my wish fulfilled and obtain some knowledge in regard to the life of the gnomes. There was now a good chance to get the better of Professor Cracker and the likes of him. I therefore said, "It is I, madam, who would always be at your service. But if you would do me a favor, I would, with your permission, take a look into the kingdom of the gnomes." Thereupon the princess crossed her hands upon her bosom and bowing low, she said, "Thy wish, O beloved and all-knowing one, is to me a command. Nothing shall hereafter separate me from thy glorious presence. Follow me, O my lord." Having spoken these words, her form dissolved, losing its human shape and becoming, as it were, a ball of light with a fiery center. This ball floated away and I followed. Was it that there was something the matter with the rocks or with myself? The walls of rock offered no resistance. We passed through them as we would pass through a London fog. It was such a strange experience that, if I did not know myself, I should be inclined to doubt my own words. We might have been traveling for about 10 minutes at the rate of what I should judge to have been about 10 miles an hour, the princess literally acting as my guiding star, when the fog seemed to retreat on both sides, and in the open space I saw at a short distance a lot of other luminous balls, and in the midst of each there was a human-like form with a star upon the forehead, from which issued the light that formed the luminous spheres in which these beings lived and moved, each having its own peculiar light. Directly we entered, and were in the midst of the gnomes. They were of various sizes and colors. Some were nearly as tall as I, others like dwarfs. They were not all of the same brightness. Some were more luminous than others, and their stars more radiant. They had all some sort of an occupation. Some were quarrying marble, from which they made works of art and curious implements. Others were engaged in mining. By some means, which I afterwards found to be the application of a substantial energy, which might be called liquid electricity, they rendered fluid the gold that glittered in yellow veins within the snow-white quartz, and after letting it run into molds the gold became again solid and hard. There was no other light than what emanated from the gnomes themselves, and I saw that the amount of light in each individual indicated the amount of his or her spiritual energy and intelligence. Those that were luminous seemed to be very clever. Others, emitting only a faint glow, looked dull and stupid, and between these two extremes there were luminous spheres and radiating stars of different degrees of brightness, exhibiting various tints and hues. But in the majority of them a tint of green could be perceived. They were what may be called spirits, in spite of all that may be said to the contrary by Professor Cracker, and their bodies were of a substantial kind. Their forms were not permanent, nor were they, as spirits, dependent upon the existence of their forms. In their normal and spiritual condition they were like individual currents of air that blow here and there, having no particular shape, but they assumed or projected corporeal and organized bodies whenever it was necessary for them to do so for the purpose of accomplishing some labor requiring a form, and in such cases each spirit assumed the same form again which he had before he dissolved, and which corresponded to his individual character. And he did this, not as a matter of choice, but of necessity, for such is the law of their nature, that to each character belongs a certain form of expression. A good gnome always assumes the same beautiful shape which he had in his previous embodiment, and whenever a wicked gnome dissolved and again took form, he acquired again the same distorted shape, the same features and clothing as before. But this is a digression, and I must continue my account. At my approach those who beheld me first were very much frightened, and dissolved into spheres of light, which grew less luminous as they expanded. This called the attention of the rest to my presence, whereupon what I would call a general scattering and dissolving took place. Everybody vanished, and from all sides resounded the cries, "Spook! A hobgoblin! A ghost!" Even the princess became affected by the general panic, so that she lost her presence of mind and disappeared, and the place would have been completely dark but for the fact that in the place of each gnome there was a fiery spark, corresponding in color to the light that belonged to each individual. Thus the whole place was dotted with sparks of various colors, resembling jewels emitting magnetic rays. In the place of a dalga there was a beautiful pearl. There were brilliant diamonds, sapphires emitting a fine blue light, red glowing rubies, glittering emeralds, amethysts, smaragds, and other jewels of various kinds. Some very tiny, others of considerable size, but all had the same mysterious luster, the same quality of fire. The difference was only in the amount and color of the light they emitted. I then remembered some tale which I had heard of people who went into the Untersberg and found untold treasures of gold and silver and precious stones, but were too much dazzled by the sight of so much wealth that they entirely forgot to pocket any of the jewels, and thought of it only after returning with empty hands. I therefore made up my mind not to lose this opportunity, and started to take one precious emerald, but a faint, childlike voice cried out to me, "Touch me not, touch me not." I then stretched out my hand towards others, but from each and every one came the same answer, "Touch me not." However, I was not to be disappointed, so I gathered my courage and made a resolute grab at a great diamond. But on doing so I received an electric shock that threw me upon the ground. At the same time, a clap of thunder reverberated through the hall, and the next moment the precious stones had disappeared, and I stood in the midst of a crowd of gnomes who were talking and gesticulating in an excited manner. They all looked upon me with indignation, and even Adalga's face expressed disappointment and doubt. But one of the gnomes, a very bright fellow, the one who had been the diamond, came forward and, assuming a threatening attitude, shook his fist at me and angrily exclaimed, "This specter has attempted my life. Why should we be afraid of a ghost that has no substance and is merely a compound of delusions? Let us drive it away, make it vanish." In answer to this, and as if by common consent, all the gnomes shook their fists and cried, "Put it out, let it be evaporated." "This is a queer reception," I said to the princess. "It is quite unexpected. I am neither a specter nor a ghost, and not prepared to evaporate. I am a man." Then the princess came forward, and holding up her hand as a sign that everyone should be silent, she said, "Do him no harm. Touch him not. He is a man." "A man!" exclaimed the gnomes, pushing forward and staring at me, while the one who had spoken first asked the princess, "How do you perceive him to be a man?" "He told me so himself," answered the princess. A general "ah" was the reply of the gnomes. "He said so himself. He told it to her." They whispered to each other. The threatening attitude of the gnomes at once changed into one of respect. "A man!" they exclaimed, and the cry was repeated until from all parts of the open space it was echoed back by many voices shouting, "A man?" And through all the caves of the Untersberg the cry was resounded, "A man has come among us! A man! Let his name be blessed! All hail to Mulligan, the savior of our world!" Now from all sides gnomes came forward and stared at me. Some were old and others were young, men, women, and children. Some dressed in jackets, others in gowns, many wearing hoods upon their heads, whose pointed ends hung down over their backs. I could not quite understand why they should be so much surprised at seeing a man, and expressed my surprise about it, saying that in the world where I lived men were as plentiful as bugs on a tree, while gnomes were exceedingly scarce, so that hardly anybody seriously believed in their existence, and that nobody would dare to say openly that he ever saw a gnome, for fear that somebody might laugh in his face. Much better would it have been for me if I had been less loquacious, for I saw that some of the more intelligent gnomes looked now very indignant, and one of the wise ones came forward and said, "Although you said yourself that you were a man, nevertheless I perceive in you only an inferior being, perhaps a hobgoblin. For how is it possible that men, being omnipotent and all-knowing spirits, should not know that we exist, and that they would be afraid of speaking the truth? Only a blaspheming elemental would dare to say that real men were subject to animal passions. How could the Creator of all be ignorant of the existence of his creatures? How could he who rests on his own self-consciousness and is affected by nothing suffer from fear?" I did not know what to say, but while trying to think of an answer to subdue the rising storm, for I saw that the gnomes were getting angry, the attention of the crowd was attracted towards the further end of the hall, where a large globe of yellow light appeared, which in coming nearer became condensed into a human form, appearing as a gnome of venerable aspect, with a jewel looking like a fiery topaz upon his head. He had a white beard, and was dressed in a black cloak or cape, and short trousers, stockings, and buckled shoes. In his hand he held something that looked like a tube or telescope. He was, as I heard them say, Prince Kravatu, minister to the king. As he approached, all the gnomes became silent and waited in mute expectation for what he would have to say. He came up to me very close and looked at me through his tube, which turned out to be a spiritoscope. The time during which he examined me seemed to me an eternity, but at last he finished and spoke the ominous words, Umbra simi vulgaris. I knew enough Latin to understand that he said I was the ghost of a common ape. A general laughter arose, which was followed by murmurs of dissatisfaction. Kravata's unkind remark wounded my feelings, and I therefore said, "It is perhaps yourself who is a ghost and a monkey, Mr. Smarty. I am a man, and never had any monkey in my family. My father was Thomas Mulligan, a member of as good standing in the church as anybody, and my mother's name was Bridget O'Flanagan, and they were married by Father Murphy, the parish priest." And talking myself into a sort of excitement, I proceeded to pull off my coat and continued, "Just come out of here, you brute, and I will show you whether or not I am a man. I will blacken your eyes and turn you into a kettle drum. I will make you think that 1,000 monkeys have come to scratch your head, you blackguard." It was evident that among all present there was none who understood my speech, and Adalga seemed to listen to it with delight. Kravatu looked again and said, addressing the gnomes, "He is from the land of dreams, and the product of an illusion. There is not a spark of spiritual energy discoverable in him. His language appears to belong to a certain tribe of monkeys inhabiting the dark and impenetrable continent that lies beyond the confines of our kingdom, where all sorts of hobgoblins, devils, and monsters exist, whose greatest pleasure it is to torture each other. Among them you will find different degrees of insanity. They wander about in the dark, without knowing from whence they came or what will be the end of their journey, turning around in a circular dance, sometimes whirling in one direction and then again in another, always returning to the place from which they started, without making any progress. Nevertheless, some of them are said to enjoy their condition, because they do not know anything better. They do not know their own selves, and they are not alive. They only dream that they live, and mistake their dreams for realities. Some of them may even dream to be men. They are dreams in a dream. They have their imaginary dream knowledge, dream pleasures, and dream sorrows, and imagine them to be real. After a certain time they evaporate. Something in Kravata's manner made me feel that there was a grain of truth in what he said, and kept me from getting angry, but I did not like to hear a gnome speaking so disrespectfully of the human race. I therefore said, "I beg pardon. The place which you describe may be purgatory or something worse, but not our world, in which it is, after all, very pleasant to live. We are neither fools nor idiots, but we have among us people of great learning, scientists and inventors, and we have many things which are quite beyond the power of the comprehension of a gnome." "Listen to that phantom," exclaimed Kravatu. "How every word of his confirms what I said. It would be impossible to convince the product of a delusion that he is only an illusion, because, believing himself to be real, all his delusions seem real to him. Not knowing their own real self, but only what appears to be their self, they do not perceive anything real, but see only that which appears to be, and never that which really is." Upon this a general discussion took place. Some of the gnomes expressed their opinion that I might be a man after all without knowing it. Others said that they perceived that I was only a spook. Some thought I was a cheat, and others expressed their belief that I was the product of an auto-suggestion. At last some of the brightest gnomes held a consultation together, and when it was ended, one of the wisest-looking came up to me and said, "We will allow you fair play. Men are all-knowing, and if you are a man, you will be able to answer a question. Will you therefore have the kindness to tell us what is the cube root of the diameter of a circle having a periphery of 3, 14, 15, if you please?" This of course I did not know, and therefore I said, "I am not a mathematician, and you will therefore have to ask me something easier." But, Even if I were an expert in mathematics, I would require a piece of paper and a pencil to figure it out. This remark of mine caused a great deal of merriment among all the gnomes present. They jumped and yelled, and punching each other's ribs with the tips of their fingers, they cried, "Ho! Ho! He does not know the cube root of the diameter of a circle having a periphery of 3, 14, 15. And from every corner of the place, where groups of gnomes were standing, and from every projecting rock, where some of them were perching and listening, shouts of derisive laughter came back, repeating the suggestive and exasperating words, "Ho! Ho! He does not know the cube root of the diameter of a circle, having a periphery of 3, 14, 15. This is very idiotic," I cried. "How could anybody know anything without figuring it out or being informed about it?" A triumphant smile appeared upon Cravata's face, and Hidalgo looked downcast and perplexed, but my remarks only increased the hilarity of the gnomes, many of whom stood upon their heads and swinging their legs, roared, "He sees nothing. He knows nothing. He imagines to know what he is informed about. He knows nothing himself." In the midst of this uproar, a blast of trumpets was heard. Order was immediately restored, and the gnomes whispered to each other, "The king." A sound as of many tinkling silver bells announced the arrival of His Majesty, and immediately afterwards I saw a globe of red light of unusual size, accompanied by many smaller ones approaching, and directly I stood in the presence of Bim Bam I, King of the Gnomes. The king, whenever he condescended to assume a corporeal form, appeared as a gnome of noble bearing, medium-sized, and of middle age, having a yellow beard, while upon his head rested a crown with many stars, the greatest of them being a large carbuncle, emitting a living red light, which enveloped his person, and caused everything upon which it radiated to appear in a red color. "What is all this row about?" asked the king. "Has Calutho again forgotten to collect electricity from the clouds, and to supply with vitality the roots of the buttercups on the eastern side of the mountain?" "Worse than that, your majesty," replied Cravatu, saluting the king. "A specter from the country of dreams has dared to penetrate into your kingdom, and it remains with your majesty to decide what is to be done with it. It is an animal hobgoblin belonging to the third dimension of space." Thus speaking, he handed to the king the spiritoscope, through which Bim Bam I took a long look at me, and returning it to the minister, he spoke only one word, "Empty." "What is most curious about it, if your majesty will permit," continued Cravatu, "is that this three-dimensional apparition dreams that it is one of those supernatural beings which once existed upon the earth and were called men." Upon hearing these words, the king broke out into such a roar of laughter that it was fearful to behold. He held his sides and laughed so that it shook the rocks and disintegrated some of them, while all the gnomes laughed with him. When the noise had subsided, Cravatu again spoke and said, "If it pleases your majesty to observe that the semi-intellectual forces in nature produce such elemental forms, they do nothing by their own volition, but act only according to the influences which act upon them. Anybody can make them do as he pleases." So saying, Cravatu made a sign to one of the gnomes, whom I afterwards learned to know as Clavo, the commanding general of the army. He was a robust fellow and very quick. Before I knew what he was about, he drew a pin, which he carried in a scabbard by his side, and stuck it into my back. I cried out and made a jump. "It is evident," said the king, "that he is an elemental. Spirits do not squeal and jump when they are stuck with a pin." This remark annoyed me, and I howled. "I do not claim to be a spirit. I only said that I am a man." His Majesty grinned ironically. "Who ever heard," he said, "of a real man who is not a spirit?" Cravata then motioned to another gnome who carried a fiddle under his arm, and that fellow, understanding the order, began to play a jig. I am a great lover of music and love to dance, and this surely was the best Irish jig I ever listened to. But I did not want to make an exhibition of myself before the king, and resisted the impulse. At last, however, the music got the best of me. My legs began to jerk, and before I really knew what I was doing, I danced the jig as lively as I ever danced one in my life. "He dreams that he is a man," said the king, "but he is only a product of nature. If you stick his body with a pin, it jumps. If you fiddle to his legs, he dreams that he must dance. I do not perceive any spirit nor anything supernatural in him. He is only a composition of semi-intelligent forces of nature. One can make such a compound do what one likes. We can make it amiable or disagreeable, gay or sorry, angry or contented, envious or generous, jealous, furious, or whatever one likes. While the king spoke these words, the princess gave a faint cry, and as I looked at her I saw that the silvery white of her star had assumed a bluish tint. This was noticed by all the gnomes, and they became very much alarmed. "Her Royal Highness, the princess, has fallen in love," cried Cravatu, in a sorrowful tone, and the king quickly replied, "Let the physician of the court be summoned immediately." These words were hardly spoken when the doctor made his appearance. He was an old fellow, with a benevolent expression, wearing a blue cape with yellow borders. He had a gray beard, and wore a pair of golden spectacles. Unlike our doctors, he did not ask the patient any questions. He did not feel her pulse, nor even look at her tongue. But, like all gnomes, he knew things by direct perception, and saw immediately what was the matter with her. Turning to the king, he expressed his sorrow that such an unfortunate accident should have happened to a member of the royal family, and for the purpose of removing the cause of the disease, he advised the king that the object of the affection of the princess, meaning myself, should have his head sawed off immediately. To my horror, Adalga consented cheerfully, and the king was about to give the required order when the doctor spoke again and said, "If Her Royal Highness would consent to wait until the next night, I would propose to preserve the subject, and instead of sawing its head off, have it dissected alive in the presence of the medical faculty, as it would be very interesting to our physiologists to see of what material spooks are made. If the princess would consent to have that much patience, the whole profession would be thankful to her." The princess declared herself willing to wait, and said that the sensation she experienced was rather pleasant than painful to her. Thereupon the king said in a stern manner, "See that he does not escape. Put him under the jumping jack." So saying, the king and his suite turned to go. The jumping jack! What a horror crept over me when I heard these terrible words. My frame began to tremble, and my hair stood on one end at the very thought of this jumping jack, although I had not the faintest idea of what it was, but imagined it to be some instrument of torture. Soon, however, I had my doubts cleared up, for the head executioner, a strong fellow in a scarlet robe, together with his attendants, brought forth the instrument. It consisted of a yellow stick, upon which a wooden monkey, painted purple, was with its hands attached to a movable crossbar at the top, leaving the body free to climb up and down. This they placed before me, planting the stick into the ground, and by means of some contrivance unknown to me, they set the wooden monkey a-going and quietly walked away, leaving me alone with the princess. I do not know how it came, but that wooden monkey exerted a powerful influence over me. I had often seen such jumping jacks at toy shops, but never experienced such an attraction before. I could not divert my eyes from that monkey. I called myself 1,000 times a fool for paying any attention at all to a jumping jack, and nevertheless it kept me spellbound. I could do nothing else but sit there with my eyes rivet upon that monkey. I knew that the princess was still with me, and I heard her imploring me with tears, by all that was sacred to me, to desist from paying attention to that jumping jack. "Dearest Mulligan," she cried, "why will you not desist from worshipping that monkey? Why will you not make love to me? See, the doors are open, and there is nothing to hinder us to depart. Have I not promised you to follow you wherever you go? Let me alone." I cried in rage. "I cannot take my eyes away from that confounded jack." "Is this your manhood?" continued Adalga, weeping and wringing her hands. "Are you a supernatural being, and the sight of a monkey can make you forget yourself and your promises? Is this your love and affection for me, which a purple monkey can steal away? Umuliga, Mulligan, leave off looking at that jumping jack and remember your duty. Come into my arms." "I wish that confounded hypnotism had never been invented," I cried, but for all that I was not able to break the spell. The princess kept on crying bitterly and begging me to desist. I heard her speak, but what she said had no effect upon me. What did I care for a princess, while I enjoyed the sight of that dear jumping jack. I knew that if I did not control myself, I would have to remain in this situation and be tortured to death at the appointed hour. But what was that to me? I cared for nothing else but for the sight of that monkey in whom all my affections were centered. I thought of the princess with entire indifference. Oh, how I loved that jumping jack! It was as dear to me as if it had been my own self. I could not think of anything but of that jumping jack, and I involuntarily hummed the song in which my situation was so well portrayed by the words of a well-known poet. Willie had a purple monkey climbing on a yellow stick. It never occurred to me to lick off the paint. I knew nothing more. I was asleep, with the jumping jack in my arms. 4. Among the Gnomes. While I was sleeping, I experienced a horrible dream. The jumping jack before me assumed the features of a baboon, having a great resemblance to Professor Cracker. And besides this, there were two grotesque figures standing at the foot of the pole. One was wooden Nutcracker with goggle eyes, a long nose and protruding chin, the very image of Jeremiah Stiffbone, and the other a curiously shaped whiskey jug of stoneware, having the form and features of Mr. Scalawag. And while the monkey was moving up and down on the pole, the Nutcracker and the whiskey jug danced, and all three sang the following song. Huzzah and heyday! Up and down we go, there being nothing that we do not know. We prove that black is white and white is black, and all the world admires the jumping jack. And as we jump go jumping all the rest. Who jumps the highest knows his business best. Forward and backward on the beaten track, there's nothing greater than a jumping jack. And to our stick we cling from first to last. Who asks for more is only a fantast. Thus up and down we go, upward and back. This is the glory of a jumping jack. After they finished singing, the Nutcracker sniffed the air with his nose and turned his goggle eyes in the direction where I was hidden, after which his jaws began to move, and he said, I am smelling human flesh. There is someone present. To this the whiskey jug replied, while grinning from ear to ear, Who knows, but it may be Mr. Schneider, or his ghost. Mr. Schneider has no ghost, said the baboon. If we were to find one, we would have to destroy it immediately to save the reputation of science. I am quite sure that something of that kind is hidden somewhere, replied the Nutcracker, and turning to the baboon, he asked, Do you see anything? Seeing is deceptive, answered the baboon, but we will see whether we cannot reason it out. Wait till I come down. So saying, the monkey stopped his motions, and to my horror I saw him unfastening his hands from the crossbar. Climbing down the yellow stick, he joined the whiskey jug and the Nutcracker, and all three searched the place and almost stumbled over me, but they did not see me. There is nothing, said the baboon. However, there can be no doubt that Schneider is dead, and the only thing to be regretted about it is that he did not die in the interest of science. If we had known that he was going to die anyhow, we might have subjected him to certain experiments. Strange to say, during this dream I had no thought of being a mulligan, but my individuality was changed back to Mr. Schneider. When I awoke, Schneider was gone, and I was once more mulligan. De mortuis nil nisi bene, drawled out the Nutcracker. But if Schneider had died in the interest of science, it would have been the first useful thing he ever did. So saying, the Nutcracker clapped his jaws. The whiskey jug blinked with his little eyes and added, He meant well, but I knew what he was going to say, and this made me very angry. I therefore jumped at him and gave him a box on the ear. But my fist went quite through his head, and it had no other effect upon him than stopping his sentence. He did not seem to notice it, but I now knew that I had died and become a spirit. I also saw that I could take possession of people and use their organs of speech, and as the Nutcracker was nearest to me, I went inside of him and caused him to exclaim, I will show you whether or not I am a well-meaning fool. Confound you and your science. I have been among the gnomes and know that they exist, but you are the blind fools who cannot see anything because you are too stupid to open your eyes. Brother Stiffbone has become insane, said the baboon. Let us tie him before he does us any injury. Thereupon the baboon and the whiskey jug went for me while I was in the Nutcracker's body, and I went in that shape for them. I snapped at the baboon's ear and gave him a black eye, and I tore out a handful of hair from the head of the whiskey jug, who in his turn broke that is to say, the Nutcracker's nose. At last they got the best of me, because the wooden limbs of the nutcracker were so stiff and I could not move them quickly enough. We fell down, and the baboon was kneeling upon my breast when I awoke. Once more I was Mr. Mulligan. I opened my eyes and found myself in inky darkness. The first thing I did was to feel my nose to see whether it was broken. The nose was all right, and its solidity convinced me that I was no ghost, and my adventure with the nutcracker's body, however real it seemed, had been only a dream. I groped about for the purpose of finding the jumping jack, but it was gone. Neither did I regret its absence, for with the sight of it all my affection for it had departed, and I could not understand how I could have been so foolish as to permit myself to be attracted by it. My desire for the purple monkey had left me, but my love for the princess returned. I yearned for her presence and called her name, but no answer came. There was nothing around me but darkness and solitude. Ever since that event I have often asked myself, why do we hate to be for a long time alone? The only answer I could find is that when we are alone with ourselves, the company of ourself is not sufficiently satisfactory and agreeable to us. Perhaps we do not sufficiently know that self to fully enjoy its presence. Perhaps we do not know that self at all, and then of course we are in company with something we do not know, which means in company with nothing, and to enjoy the presence of nothing is to have no enjoyment at all. I confess that I never realized my own nothingness so much as on that occasion. The old doubts returned again. I did not know whether I was living or whether something which imagined itself to be I seemed to live, and if that which only seemed to be myself was to be vivisected, why should I trouble myself about it, as the vivisection of something unknown to me did not concern me at all, unless I voluntarily chose to take any interest in it. But how could I think of making any choice at all if that I was something unknown? I instinctively refused to recognize as myself that personality which was governed by the spell of a jumping jack, and I spoke to myself as if I were another person. "Well, Mulligan," I said, "how could you be such an idiot as to submit yourself to the power of a baboon? Really, I doubt whether you are a man. Pshaw, the gnomes are right. You are a monkey yourself, and even inferior to a monkey, because the baboon was your master. A nice lord of creation you are, being controlled by the creation of your own foolish fancy. A lord of creation, indeed, one who cannot even resist the attraction of a jumping jack." Thus I went on moralizing, and wondered what my real ego was, and whether it had anything at all to do with what seemed to be myself. I wished to know whether I, that is to say, my real self, was, for what purpose I was in the world, and where I had been before I entered the world, and what that was which caused me to be born, and whether I would be born again after I, that is to say, my body, had been dissected. Alas, for all these questions cracker science had no answer to give, and I envied the gnomes who had the ability to dissolve and condense into bodies at will. The darkness was very oppressive, and I wished that I could be self-luminous like a gnome, and not be dependent upon an external light for the purpose of seeing. I wondered whether, perhaps, after the dissection of my body, my spirit would have a light of its own, or whether Bim Bam was right when he pronounced the suggestive word, empty. Then something, of which I do not know what it was, made me think that the worst thing anybody could possibly do was to doubt or deny the presence of a spiritual light within himself. And while I studied as to what may be that which made me think so, I came to the conclusion that it was my own spirit reminding me of its presence, and this was a more convincing proof to me that I actually had a spirit than all the arguments offered to the contrary by Professor Cracker and his ilk. With this conviction, a great deal of calmness and satisfaction came over me. At the same time, the darkness grew less in intensity. A silvery mist, tinged with blue, arose like the dawn that precedes the rising sun. The light grew stronger and condensed in a luminous ball, and the next instant the princess stood before me. "Dearest Adalga," I said, "where have you been so long, and why did you leave me alone in this horrible darkness?" To this the princess answered, "Truth never departs, but error always attracts us. Never for an instant have I deserted you. I was with you and around you all the time, but you kept your eyes closed and refused to see." "On the contrary," I replied, "I strained my eyes to look through the darkness, but there was nothing." "You strained your eyes," answered the princess, "for the purpose of seeing my form, which was not formed, and which could not be seen." but you made no effort to see that which is without form, but which may be seen with the inner eye. Know, my beloved, that when you see my form you do not see me, and when you do not see my form you may see me in truth. This, I said, is contrary to all the doctrines of our science, which teaches that we can see nothing whatever unless it has a shape of some kind. The eye of science sees only the outward form, answered Adalga, but the eye of wisdom sees the reality itself. I understand, I replied. I have learned a lesson, and henceforth the delusion caused by forms shall have no more power over me. But tell me, dear, is the hour of vivisection approaching? Is there no way for escape? Alas, no, sighed the princess. There is a jumping jack at every door. A thrill of horror swept through me when I heard these words and made me tremble. A moment before I had called myself a fool for being afraid of a jumping jack, and now at the very mention of such a toy the old terror came back. I knew that I could not escape, because I would not dare to face a jumping jack again. I would be sure to succumb to its influence. But, continued Adalga, why should you be afraid of being dissected? Can you not create for yourself a new body again? Nonsense, I cried. I am not a creator. But, sure enough, answered the princess, you have a creative spirit in you. Oh, my dear Mulligan, why will you remain incognito among us? Why do you continue to be dark? Why will you disguise yourself before me? Is it that I am not worthy to behold your true light, or that my eyes would be dazzled by its splendor? Lord of my heart, unveil yourself to me. Show yourself to me in your own essence. Dearest princess, I replied, I do not know what you are talking about. I am not luminous, and I never saw a luminous man. In our country nobody has a light of his own. Alas, said the princess, what a fearful fate it must be to have no light, and to live in a country of perpetual darkness. To this I replied, this is not so. Nobody in our country needs a light of his own, because we have one great luminary, called the sun, right over our head, and the light of that sun illuminates our world. And can everybody see that sun? Asked the princess. Of course, I said, everybody, unless he is as blind as a bat. When I had spoken these words, the princess threw her arms around my neck and whispered to me, Dearest Mulligan, I have a favor to ask you. Please fetch me the sun. This is quite impossible, I said, for although we all live in the light of the sun, nevertheless we cannot approach the sun, nor put him into our pockets. But the princess was not satisfied with that answer. Surely, she exclaimed, you told me that the sun was right above your heads. You ought not to refuse me the first kindness I ever asked of you. I implore you to bring me the sun. I will not be contented unless I have it. I became alarmed. This is a foolish request, madam, I said. If somebody, or anybody, could claim the sun as his own and carry it away, there would be little chance for anyone else to enjoy it. The government would monopolize it and put a tax upon the use of his light. The doctors would dissect him to see of what material he is made. And there are lots of amorous fools who would not hesitate a moment to make him explode, merely for the purpose of amusing their sweethearts. But it was of no use to argue such a thing with a being unacquainted with the first rules of logic, and the princess went on with tears and sobs to beg me to fetch her the sun. I tried my best to explain to her the absurdity of the request, but she would not listen, and, weeping bitterly, she cried, "Oh, Mulligan, you do not love me. Is this your gratitude for bestowing my affection upon you?" I felt very miserable, and began to look upon myself as the most ungrateful wretch, and to appease her I promised that I would try to do all I could. At this moment a blast of trumpets and the tinkling of bells announced the arrival of the king. He was accompanied by the queen and her suite, and with them came all the nobility, the ministers, officers, and also the whole of the medical faculty, together with the head executioner and his assistants. The queen was a little fat woman, and rather homely. Upon her head shone a great emerald, throwing a soft green light around her. She was accompanied by her maids of honor, all of whom appeared in a green color. I made my bow to the queen, who, after looking at me through the spiritoscope, turned to the king and said, Is this the green hobgoblin who has the impudence of claiming that he is a man's spirit? Yes, answered the king. Only, as you will observe, he is not green, but red. Your Majesty is pleased to jest, replied the queen. Everybody sees that he is green. He is red, said the king sternly, being evidently annoyed by her contradiction. Let him be red then, if you must have it so, answered the queen, while her voice indicated vexation. But he is green for all that. Well, I declare, exclaimed Bimbamai, growing still more red. I never saw a woman in my life that did not love to contradict. I say he is red, and I will leave it to Cravatu to decide. Cravata stepped forward, letting his yellow light fall directly upon me, and after scanning me very carefully, he said, I beg pardon, your majesties, but the hobgoblin is of a bright yellow color. Are you all making sport of me? Cried the king in a rage, and turning to the princess, he asked, What does Adalga say? He appears to me in a silvery light shaded with blue, answered the princess, but according to his own statement, he does not shine at all. The gnomes looked at each other in amazement, and Cravatu said, He is a wizard who appears to everyone in another light. But the princess continued, Although he does not shine, he has a much greater light than we all, for it shines upon everything. He calls it a sun, and he has promised to fetch it to me. Therefore the king ordered that I should immediately show him the sun, and when I succeeded in making him understand that it could not be removed from its place in the universe, and that the only way of convincing oneself of its existence was to step within the sphere of its light, the king ordered Cravatu to select immediately a committee of 3 of the most clever gnomes for the purpose of going to the country of dreams and to hunt for the sun. Accordingly, 3 gnomes of rank were selected. They were of a white color, and the light that radiated from them was so brilliant that it dazzled one's eyes to look at it. They immediately assumed their spherical shapes and floated away. But the king ordered that my execution should be stayed until after their discovery of the sun. When I heard these words, I felt much relieved in my mind, for I had now some hope of escape. May your majesty persevere in that resolution, I said to the king, for these 3 messengers will never discover the sun. They have 2 splendid lights of their own to be able to see beyond it. They will be dazzled and blinded by their own radiance, and not look for the light of the sun. Upon hearing these words, everybody seemed highly astonished. The gnomes looked at each other in surprise and whispered, He is a prophet. He can foretell future events. This is quite supernatural. It does not require any supernatural power, I said, to be able to foretell that a thing cannot take place, on account of its being impossible. Everybody knows that a certain amount of darkness is required for the purpose of enabling one to perceive light. Those who are full of their own light cannot see the light of another, just as those who love to hear only themselves talking will not listen to what another one says. Wonderful, exclaimed the king, and Cravatu whispered to him, He is one of those who see what is not. But I continued saying, If your majesty wishes to obtain information regarding the existence of truth, I would advise you to send a committee of such as are less conceited and capable of seeing beyond the wall which their egoism has built around them. I was still speaking when the 3 gnomes returned, and they reported unanimously that they had been to Dreamland, and that they had seen no other light but their own, and that it was an absurdity to believe in the existence of a universal sun. For if there were such a light, it could not have escaped their notice, and moreover, the presence of such a light would make everybody look of the same color, so that not one person could be distinguished from another. Thereupon all the dark gnomes, such as had as little light and intelligence as possible, were gathered, and out of them the king selected 3 almost entirely dark dwarfs. They were surely the most sorry-looking imbeciles which it has ever been my misfortune to behold. Big-headed, hydrocephalic, with shrunken brains, they were the very personification of abject stupidity. They seemed to have not more understanding than an oyster, although their power of seeing appeared good enough. These were appointed as a committee to seek for the sun, and it was ordered that they should be conducted to the frontier of the outer world, there to be left to their own fate and to begin their researches. This was accordingly done. The 3 idiots were taken away, and I pitied them, for I doubted whether they would ever have sense enough to find their way back. I am curious to hear the report of this committee, remarked the queen. Perhaps it would have been still better to blindfold them. To this I replied, I fear that your majesty will be disappointed, for even if the dwarfs perceive the sun, they will be incapable to understand what they see or to describe it. Here, here, exclaimed the king, and all the gnomes began to regard me with awe and respect. But Cravatus said, really there is more behind this person than we suspected. He is one of those who sees that which cannot be. Thereupon the king conferred upon me the office of head fortune-teller to the court, and I was treated with great respect. The whole behavior of the gnomes changed. The queen smiled at me and invited me to the palace. But the princess was delighted, and as she took my arm, she said to me with a triumphant smile, I knew that you were more than a spook after all.